will start by alluding to what X is in my title, rather than leave you waiting until the end. Well, when this was set up, we foresaw that the energy transition was not going to be straightforward. The Power to X title is not unique to Lloyd's Register. But the way we view Power to X is it's the use of clean energy sources for the production of alternative fuels, which also includes nuclear. Hence, I inherited the entire nuclear portfolio at Lloyd's Register for the production of alternative fuels, all the way through to direct nuclear propulsion for ships, which I have to say is a massively exciting space in which to work. Now, it was mentioned I was going to talk about elephants, and I think that's the kindest way to introduce nuclear. And I don't think we have an elephant in the room. I think we probably have several elephants in the room. And that is a historical context, and it clouds what is a phenomenal energy source. And even amongst proponents of nuclear, it is largely understood. So today I'm not going to try and tell you everything about nuclear and why it is wonderful. What I'd like to see at the end of today is, are people curious to learn a little bit more about it? For me, that would be a successful outcome from today. Because for us at Lloyd's Register, this is not a hypothetical energy source. These are projects we're working on with real clients, with real ambition. But the next question I'm usually asked is, well, we've looked at nuclear before, many times in the past. And every single time, it's not come to fruition. And again, it's a very fair statement, and let's add that elephant to the herd that we've now got. So, if I'm here today talking about nuclear, something's changed. Well, actually, a lot has changed. And what brings us all here today is the fact that we have to achieve zero carbon emissions. And nuclear does actually do that today. In fact, if you go to third-party sources, and I'm not talking about the nuclear industry, I'm talking organisations like the UN and even the World Wind Council, they actually draw where nuclear sits on that, right at the bottom in terms of carbon emissions. That's not enough, though, to reawaken interest in nuclear. Other things have to have happened, because nuclear did not succeed in the past in civil maritime, because it was too complex and too expensive. And it was complex and expensive because that was necessary to make it safe. Something has to have changed. And the way I like to look at this is if I were to ask you to cross the Atlantic, you'd be somewhat reluctant to do it in a wooden biplane. But that's where the nuclear conversation starts today. Most of our impressions, points of reference, relate back to technologies which in some instances are over 50 years old. That is not what is on the table today. What is on the table today is generically called the Generation 4 reactors. So for them to hit the mark in terms of actually being safe and affordable, they have to do things differently. The first thing they need to adopt is the reference we're using as inherently safe physics, i.e. take away the means of failure that people are afraid of. That's one of the elephants in the room to deal with. If you can actually reduce those possibilities of accident, you actually start to make it simpler. You start to make it simpler to operate. You actually start to bring down the cost of operation. So we're starting to move into a realm which is getting interesting for our clients. What gets even more interesting in a world which is now speed constrained is that nuclear is not. You have the option of running at full speed, and that is also competitive advantage for many operators. So hopefully you're starting to see that actually there is a significant change in that nuclear world from the last time we looked at this and the last time it was done seriously in the West with the Savannah in the 60s and the 70s. These are brand new technologies. So it's not enough that we've got new technologies. There have to be people that understand those technologies. We need to be able to build on the past. And when I look at nuclear in the maritime space, I appreciate in the civil context, it's seen as something left field by a few people still. But this isn't really a revolution, it's more of an evolution. There have been more reactors employed in the maritime environment than there have on land, 700, over 70 years. That equates to a lot of practical experience. And I myself am not a nuclear engineer, but my colleagues are, and they've done this job. They've done this job from the perspective of engineering and from regulatory compliance. So we already have a pretty big toolkit in which to start this journey. Also, civil maritime nuclear still exists today. The Russians are operating floating nuclear power plants. They're selling them into Guinea. They operate civilian nuclear-powered icebreakers and one merchant vessel operating around Africa. Not significant, but again, not a starting point of zero. So we are building from experience and a past. This isn't brand new to industry or the people we work with, or even the ports that we engage in. Now, when I talk about the economics of nuclear, everyone's expecting me to come up with a number and tell them how much this reactor is going to cost. Not surprisingly, I'm not going to do that. It's sensitive. Clients are paying a lot of money to understand that. So what I'm going to do is try and frame out for you the environment of how that economics are developing. And it's not just the money. If a client is going to get finance to do this, they have to hit a number of areas. As I said, it's got to be safe. It's got to be walk away safe for not just people, but the environment. It has to have an inherently safe approach to engineering and the physics that underlies it. There's no point in it if it does not meet our net zero ambitions. And finally, it has to be economically attractive for clients to do this. So, what does that mean? Well, there are a number of different facets to this. And I've already mentioned floating nuclear power plants, ships. There are also offshore applications in oil and gas. And also, as speaking to my job title, the production of alternative fuels in the marine environment using nuclear power as well. All of these are in that mix. All of them have very different economic cases. And the next thing to note is that there are very few ship operators or even offshore operators that actually want to become experts in nuclear and set themselves up to operate reactors. So there needs to be another way to do it, which again affects the cost and how they pay for their energy. So we're seeing people talking about lease models, that they don't own the reactor, they lease the reactor and the staff to operate it. That's one option. They pay for power by the hour, a little bit akin to the aviation industry. And we also need to be thinking about the through-life cost of this, because you can buy all your energy up front on day one and know what this is going to cost you for the life of that ship. Interesting question there around the life of the ship and what that means to people today. 20 years, 30 years, 60 years. That's what nuclear also offers you, is you can actually extend out the life of your primary power source to around 60 years. And we know we can design assets for 60 to 100 years in the water. So again, it's changing some of those questions. And we don't understand all of the answers to that in terms of the economics and what that means to the way clients will operate. But what we do know, and this is taking the offshore hydrocarbon sector and the shipping sector, is some of those broad questions. And for the offshore sector, we've worked with a number of clients. And every single time we have done this, the economics of it fall out as not a driving factor behind whether or not to do this or not. It is affordable. Shipping is somewhat different. There are so many different areas to shipping. For instance, the cruise line industry is so different from the bulk carrying industry. So those economics are not the same. But again, we have worked with a number of clients, in a few areas, and the through life looks good. And that is without considering the changes that this might offer them around their business, around how they can be more competitive and efficient. So we don't think the economics now are the driving factor behind whether you do this or not. So hopefully you're seeing I'm starting to take one or two bites out of a couple of the elephants in the room. And I say I'm not trying to convince you today, just make you a little bit curious. So we have technology, we have experience, we believe the economics are fundamentally sound behind doing this. So I have an ambition, and it's an ambition that a number of us share in the industry. And that is, can we change the way we think about nuclear reactors? Today they're perceived as complex, bespoke, very specialised. You look at the offshore industry and many applications, and a gas turbine is just seen as a modular power source. That's exactly where nuclear reactors are heading in terms of their design. So in terms of all of the elements that need to support a reactor, can we start to think of it like a gas turbine? And that's where we would like to be in 15 years' time, that you think of it in that same context. So I appreciate I'm flashing through this. And at this point, someone's always asking me around, what about safety and regulation? Well, there are, in nuclear terms, 3 S's: safety, security and safeguarding. Safety is obvious, and it comes back to those terms like inherently safe physics. Safeguarding is fissile material is inherently hazardous. We need a mechanism to ensure it stays put, it is not tampered with, and the same amount comes out that went in. Security is essentially about how we manage bad actors. And that's an issue for all energy sources. We need to manage bad actors. So, to some extent, I'm going to say to you today that for a reactor to get in the water, it needs to satisfy all of those requirements. That is a 2-hour presentation in its own right. So for the moment, I'm going to park that and talk about the regulatory side that is developing. And if I had spoken to you 8 months ago about regulation in the maritime space for nuclear, what I'd have been saying would have been largely aspirational. It's not anymore. Around May time of this year, I arranged a meeting between my CEO and the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And we sat down and we discussed nuclear in maritime directly for propulsion. Now, they wanted this meeting with us because they'd heard of this movement. They'd heard there was this level of interest. 3 weeks ago, a meeting was convened by the International Atomic Energy Agency at Lloyd's Register, pulling together global regulators from the nuclear, maritime industries, potential operators, class societies, and other stakeholders, to understand what we would need to do to make this happen. The most striking thing in that room was, firstly, technology was not discussed. That was a red. But secondly, the willingness to make this happen at an international level. And for me, that was staggering to see, and to see this happen so quickly. So we're very much on a pathway, and next year the International Atomic Energy Agency will launch Atlas, which is their initiative to see global harmonisation for the regulation of nuclear reactors in concert with maritime regulators. Alongside that, and some of you may have heard of this already, and I'm very honoured to be one of the directors of NEMO, and this is an NGO set up to sit between the International Maritime Organisation and the International Atomic Energy Agency, and also address those areas that fall outside of international regulation that are necessary to make this work. That again was stood up this year in March. So there has been a huge amount of practical movement this year in getting things to happen. But it's one step on a pathway. And it's that continuous engagement and turning that engagement into working groups with regulators and different parties around the world to deliver proposals for regulation which will prove key over the next few years. Now, finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the reactors. And remember, I'm not a nuclear engineer, so this is going to be at the lower level, not the higher level. And the first thing I think to note about nuclear reactor development is there are something like 80 different developers out there for this already. The majority also aiming at the marine industry as well. 80 suppliers will not make it through in the long run. We may only end up with 10, but that will be enough. And there are not 80 different types of reactor you can have anyway. There are probably half a dozen different types that we could consider. But I'm going to talk about the three that we see as mainstream and likely to be available by 2035, or between 2030 and 2035. And yes, I have included the pressurised water reactor, and I'll explain that a little bit later. The first is the microreactor, a really exciting development. Completely sealed, consider it like a Duracell battery. Once it's depleted, remove the reactor and replace it. About the size of a 40-foot container. No moving parts. Originally designed as a battlefield reactor for the US, this concept requires no nuclear competence to operate. I don't believe any regulator will allow us to use them without competent people in the marine environment, but it's reassuring to know that A, there's not a lot to go wrong, and B, you don't need to know a lot to operate it. Secondly, the one that most people have heard about in the marine environment, the molten salt reactor, and probably the most desirable, or at least seen as the most desirable, because of the power band that it can be developed within. And again, inherently safe in its operation. On the nuclear side, we're talking about ambient pressure systems, i.e. it can't explode. The pumps fail, the thing freezes like a brick, and the heat stops and dissipates naturally. And this is what we mean when we're talking about inherently safe physics, is mechanisms that allow you to dissipate heat quickly without the intervention of another system. Someone usually said, what about if we turn it upside down? Fair point. That's one of the design and loss cases that needs to be addressed with whoever is developing this type of technology, or any of these technologies. But that is engineering. That is not something which is insurmountable. And finally, the pressurised water reactor, the same type of reactor that appeared in the Savannah in the 60s and the 70s. So why am I including it now when it failed then? Well, new reactors, all of them, are looking for passive safety, i.e. walk away safe for people and the environment, i.e. it must dissipate the heat without intervention from people. And the new pressurised water reactors can do that. They have a slightly bigger challenge than the ambient pressure systems because they need stronger containment around them because it's a pressurised system. But they are equally safe. And if I were to make a prediction, we would see the PWRs most likely to appear in the offshore sector, and to do that fairly quickly. So we have around 3 different technologies that are coming up fairly quickly that are likely to be used in the maritime environment. So for me, this is massively exciting. There are others, like lead-cooled reactors, but they're probably more like 20 years away. None of these are brand new in thinking and design. All of them have had test reactors in the past. In fact, the Chinese are operating a molten salt reactor either the back end of this year or beginning of next. So on the level of, does it work? Yes, we know they work. We're very confident in that. It's a case of making sure that they're long-lived with minimal maintenance is the primary challenge. And the technology readiness levels reflect that. We've got nothing at the very lowest levels here for nuclear technology. All of them are at a reasonable level, and in the case of the microreactors, they will start to appear around 2026 for terrestrial use. For the molten salt reactors, well, as I said, the Chinese are taking one critical this year, beginning of next. So they're not hypothetical or far away or beyond our realms of understanding, and the pressurised water reactors already exist. So this is not the big engineering challenge. This is the regulatory challenge. And I also think it's the public perception and the public engagement piece, which is the most important element and the most challenging area around this. Because whilst we've been operating nuclear for over 70 years, we haven't done a very good job of communicating about it. We've said, trust us, it's safe, and then we've had accidents. We haven't managed waste properly. So for nuclear and maritime to avoid that legacy, it has to be open and transparent. And I'm going to bring back my elephants for that one. And another one, we're going to take a bite out of it, one bite at a time. And I'm very passionate that when we look at the offshore sector, when we look at floating nuclear power, when we look at nuclear propulsion, this has to be done with public engagement and not behind closed doors. And again, this is another exciting facet of working with both the International Atomic Energy Agency and NEMO, is that they both recognise that the public journey has to be at the heart of what is happening here. And as I said, possibly the hardest element for us to engage with. So, I'm going to start wrapping up soon, but I want to tease you a little bit with how we are approaching nuclear projects, because I said this was not aspirational to us at Lloyd's Register. We have clients we're working on in terms of delivery for this. But it is a complex environment in which to work, and again, that public perception piece filters down at every stage. Take ports, for example. They are very public focused in all of their thinking, and key stakeholders in this journey. We can go and build a nuclear powered ship in 2030, and I'm quite confident of that. Are there ports that will accept it? Not unless we work very hard in engaging with them. The plus side for the ports is they need next to no infrastructure to support nuclear, which again makes it attractive, but only if there's public buy-in to deliver that. So when we work with clients, they come to us with a range of questions which are a bit of a jumble. This is new to the offshore and the marine sectors. And we've broken this down into a pathway to help clients with their first nuclear plants. The first one is, which technology is right for me? This is not just looking at the TRL levels and giving the client a set of TRL criteria to measure against. This is around technology selection. Which reactor is going to suit my operations best, my aspirations best? Which compromises do I have to make? The next question is, based on my operations, does this make economic sense? Now, I said earlier on that question had been largely answered. Yes, at a broad level, but every client is different, every operation is different. They want a detailed understanding of what those economics really look like for them. And that's something that we can do. 5 years ago, there was no one who could really do that. We've worked with partners, and that is an area that we support our clients in directly now. But it's a key part of that question of whether to do this or not. Now again, I talked about the operation of the reactor, who's going to own it. Before we get to the interesting part of designing an asset, we need to have an idea about how we want to own and operate that reactor. We might need an operating company set up to do so. Fortunately, there are companies which are in the process of setting themselves up to deliver that. So that box can be ticked, but you need to draw it into that plan at a very early stage, because you're going to need to engage regulators, and to have credibility, you've got to have operations and training at the heart of what you do. There then needs to be a regulatory framework. At the moment, we have SOLAS Chapter 8 for nuclear powered ships. And the only useful part of SOLAS Chapter 8 is its title. It was written in the 1970s for technologies that we're not going to use. So that is why the IEA and the IMO are engaged in looking at regulation in this area. It doesn't stop first movers. And when we work with first movers, obviously, it's a more complicated regulatory question, but you need to establish something. And the UK is very good in that context because we operate nuclear powered submarines under a very transparent regime from the Defence Nuclear Safety Regulator, and that is simply regulations for the operation of a nuclear powered ship. And all of that in itself is traceable back to civilian requirements. So we do have a lot to work with there. The rest of it starts to fall out into more traditional elements, the development of a classification approach and an assurance plan bespoke to that client and that client's project needs. And for me, this is an incredibly exciting area for us to work in, and the questions that get raised are things that really people have not thought of before, but also the excitement of not talking about this hypothetically anymore, but about actually doing this is extraordinary. So I'm just going to leave you with a few concluding remarks, and hopefully I'm broadly on time. I did time myself earlier today, so hopefully we're reasonably close. And that is, we are investing heavily as an industry now to deliver these outcomes for reactors at sea in the operations. That also means looking at the training, something I haven't touched on very much today, but a key part. The regulation of civil nuclear power plant informs us a great deal, and as I mentioned, the Defence Nuclear Safety Regulator in the UK gives us some of that precedent and experience to learn from, and whilst no one's going to adopt that as international regulation, it's out there, it's used, and it's commonly understood. So it gives us a start point. And also we need to make sure we employ our regulatory and risk experience in these projects as an industry, and there is a vast amount of that. And I've worked with hydrogen and ammonia projects as well, and in many respects you do the same tasks here. So a lot of this is about doing what we're really good at already, but with something which has a few elephants in the room. So I started by saying I wanted you to go away a little bit more curious about this, but also I hope you appreciate that some of those elephants I introduced at the beginning, we've been taking a bite out of not just one elephant at a time, but a lot of those elephants at a time. And we're quite well advanced with this journey. So with that, I'll wrap up and hand back, and thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
The answer is yes. There are 700 reactors that have been deployed in defence contexts around the world, and many people will rightly tell you that it's been done very safely for 70 years. I also like to point out that it's not been done without accidents either, and I think that's really important to note. There have been accidents. There have not been high consequences from those accidents, and for me that is the most important takeaway. But absolutely, we should be using these people, we should be using this experience to talk about what they have done. And the fact that I have an enormous amount of respect for these colleagues. Most of them are not rocket scientists. They've managed to operate these submarines without degrees in physics. So it does not require the advanced level of skill that some people seem to believe is necessary, and especially with the new generation 4 reactors being designed as inherently safe and walkaway safe. That level of competence will not be required as that we've previously seen, and that is the same, I think, with most technologies and most industries. They're started by experts, and then in the end, such as with the PC and the mobile phone, we all use them. I'm not suggesting we're going to have a reactor in the garage, but we probably don't need the same level of competence that people perceive.
If there would be a proliferation of fissile materials, then the security question is the obvious one. Coupled with that, another question about decommissioning at the end of life. How would that work, and especially if there were going to be, potentially could be lots of materials around?
Right, you're right. Two questions then. I'll deal with the security one first, because the security one is a hard one. And some of that comes down to risk. The first thing I'd say with these reactors is they're not easy to get into. And if you did manage to get into those reactors, it's really difficult to take the material out. The nature of the material that's in there is likely to kill you pretty quickly if you try and remove it. So that is a line of defence. But at the International Atomic Energy Agency, you have to define major security risks that you need to satisfy. And I'm just trying to think of the acronym in my head, always goes at the worst possible time. Design basis threat, that is what you have to address for each type of technology and for each application. And that is your safeguard for the inherent security in the design. We haven't seen the first of these reactors deployed yet, and I think the first ones will have some quite interesting security features around them, but it is paramount that that is there. We're also helped by the fact we're not going to go from 0 reactors to thousands of reactors over a 1 or 2 year period. It's going to take a while to build up in that space, and that gives also the chance to actually further enhance those security measures. On the practical level, if you wanted to get hold of material, there are much easier places to get it than reactors. And I think it's highly unlikely they would be used as a source of obtaining that material. It's also worth pointing out that the material in these reactors is completely useless in conventional nuclear weapons. It would require a high degree of enrichment, which, as we have seen, is beyond the means of most countries and certainly beyond the means of of all terrorist organisations. And your second one, I think, was end of life. And again, I think this addresses one of those elephants in the room when we look at sites such as Sellafield, which date back to the 1950s. And in only this week, there were reports of leaks from some of the storage ponds. And I think the public are quite right to look at this critically, which means that when we're looking at nuclear and maritime, we are very much looking at what is the end-of-life scenario of these reactors, how much waste is produced. What was my colleagues prefer to call it spent fuel. So firstly, it's a really small amount. It's about the size of one of those glasses after 30 years. That is the spent fuel. You then have a reactor which at some point will reach an end of life. But most of the materials in that reactor are reusable. So we need to think circularly about what we're doing with this. And the other thing I would say is all industries end up with waste products. They don't always want to think of it, but they do. In the nuclear industry, I think it's actually got, in the last 10, 15 years, a fantastic track record. It is the only industry in the world which is able to tell you what the waste product is, how much of it they've got, what risk it poses, and exactly where it is, and for exactly how long it remains a hazard. And not all of those wastes are equal. They're hazardous, some for 5 years, some 100,000 years. And the longer-lived ones, much smaller volume than the shorter. So hopefully it's not a complete answer, but gives you a little bit of a shape to it.
Any more questions? Go for it.
I think there's an opportunity for comparative impacts in the public relations story as well. Because if we look at the impact of fossil fuels and the damage that has been done to the planet and society compared to the potential impact of proliferation of nuclear, and the nuclear impacts tend to be much more localised, if there are any. And then even the story starts with particulates from vessels and the impact on human health around ports. Every single vessel currently is damaging human health as it comes and goes from shoreline. And nuclear would not.
Absolutely. The dustbin for the fossil fuel industry is my lungs. And I think that's a huge distinction to make, is that we're actually talking about taking a responsible attitude to waste products and all of the industries producing.
Any more questions? Well, I've got a few of my own. Just an opinion, really. I mean, do you really believe the nuclear will get the public support?
Yes. To be honest, I've been astonished the last 8 to 12 months. Every door I've pushed on has opened. And the change, there has been a big swing. Not everybody, and not everybody is ever going to believe it. Some people are just going to be adamant that they just don't want it. But there is a huge swing towards it, and I really didn't predict it 12 months ago. That's more or less most places we look in the world. Take Australia, for example. It's illegal to have nuclear power in Australia. They have one of the best reactors in the world, and they dump all of that heat into the atmosphere. But they can't have nuclear power. But public perception in Australia alone is changing. And for me, these are some of those key indicators. But it's an elephant, and that elephant's going to need quite a lot of bites.
And you could educate me as well, because I'm not an expert in nuclear at all, but fusion, you haven't mentioned fusion.
I deliberately haven't mentioned fusion because we're trying to operate in a time frame of 2030 to 2035. I find fusion exciting, but probably not in a 20-year window for shipping. I think it will come, and a little selfishly perhaps, outside of my career, hence that's why I've not brought it in here today, but also clients are asking us what can they do in the next 15 years, 5 to 15 years, not 20 to 25, which is why we're focused on what's deliverable in the near term.
An elephant in the room for me actually is around standards and regulation.
Mm-hmm.
We heard a lot about that yesterday. You mentioned about NEMO, and I assume that would include the standards that are required.
Absolutely. I mean, what we're talking about, because we need to have something which international regulators and national regulators can understand, is an open architecture to the regulation. Firstly, it's got to be open and easily understood. Nuclear regulation at the moment is not. These technologies also need to be able to take advantage of existing standards. We don't need to create too many new wheels. What we need to do is to build an open approach on how to deliver that. Now, first, clients always inform on approach, but the aim will be to develop that open architecture to help drive down that cost.
I mean, just a point I'm going to make is obviously from a hydrogen perspective, we've had hydrogen on vessels for decades, and fuel cells as well for decades, but the standards and regulations are not here. So do you really believe, I mean, obviously you're doing the work now, will they be ready?
That's a side that doesn't really worry me too much. We've operated 700 reactors in the marine environment, and whilst these new technologies are different, they're not at the same time. This is why it's evolution, not revolution. Valves are valves. We might put different requirements on them and call them a different standard. However, it's not really that difficult in the nuclear world.
And then my last question also relates to a question here is how do we increase the visibility of blue education, so the skills, education, and how do we educate the decision makers? That
is a challenge, and I spend a lot of my time going around the world talking to national regulators and also engaging with some of the world's politicians as well. Because they're an aspect of society which usually has the same level of knowledge and understanding as general society around nuclear. And if it were just me, I wouldn't be standing in front of you today for one thing. But there are now a lot of people and a lot of organisations who get this and are engaged in that at high levels around the world. And it needs to be a global approach. And it's another reason why I'm so delighted the International Atomic Energy Agency is engaged from the Director General down.
Let's thank Mark once again for his presentation. Thank you.